Hello, CSW members, and thank you for joining us for another webinar. My name is Alexandra Zanis. I am the Social Policy and Communications Coordinator here at the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Thank you for joining us for another hour-long webinar. We are so happy to have you wherever you are, wherever you're at. You're joining us for another amazing continuing education opportunity. I am truly, in full transparency, very excited for this webinar. I had the pleasure and honor of working with Dr. Beth Martin and Dr. Melissa Redmond previously in my schooling at Carleton. So I am very excited to be joined by both of them today for what's going to be an incredible webinar. A couple little housekeeping notes before we get into this content. Just so you know, everything on your screen is completely customizable. So you can make the slides bigger, you can make us bigger, you can minimize, just make it the best for your viewing needs. In terms of question and answers, there should be a question and answer box available for you. You can type any kind of tech questions you may have, but also questions about the content. Don't worry about keeping your questions until the end of the presentation. Feel free to pop them into the chat whenever they come into your mind, and I'd be happy to compile them for a more formal question and answer period towards the end of the session. So just type in those questions as they come to you. We love to hear from you. In terms of everything else, you should be able to get your continuing education certificate or your certificate of attendance with the course completion tracker, the little check mark at the bottom there. That will be available to you once you've viewed 40 minutes of the presentation. You're also welcome to log into the platform anytime to access that. You don't have to have it today. You can access it anytime. Other than that, I am going to pass it over to our two webinar presenters. I've already done a little bit of an introduction from them both, but maybe they'll speak a little bit more into terms of what they do. Today's presentation, if you are in with us, it is Canadian Immigration Policies and Family Reunification, the implications for social work practice. So thank you so much. We're so excited to have you, and take it away.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Alexandra. Hi, everybody all over Canada. Really excited about the presentation today. So I'm Beth Martin. I'm at the Carleton School of Social Work, and my research and my professional work has all been around immigration, and especially in relation to immigration and family separation and family reunification. As you've probably already gathered by my accent, I am also an immigrant myself. To situate myself, I am separated from my extended family, so that's part of it. But a lot of my research came directly from my practice work that I'll be talking about later in the presentation. Over to you, Melissa.
And I'm Melissa Redmond. I also teach at the School of Social Work at Carleton University. I'm delighted to be able to be here with Beth. And what can I say? I was also very happy to be able to talk with Beth about her work, and to be able to take part in this presentation. I am a descendant of immigrants, and so my aunt and my mother came to Canada as part of what would now be called the Live-in Caregiver program, and grew up listening to stories that they would tell about that. So I'm actually really happy to also be able to think about these regulations and practices in a new and different way. So I'm looking forward to being here, and thank you for letting me get zhuzhed up for work for the first time in months. So.
So before we do anything, we'd first like to begin by acknowledging that this presentation was created on and is being given from the unceded and traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. And we'd like to encourage each of you just to take a moment right now to acknowledge the land from which you're listening to this presentation. We believe that together we must honour that our being here is a legacy of colonialism, a legacy of racism and pain, of loss of land and loss of culture. And it's of course particularly important and relevant to think about this for a presentation about immigration that's been built on settler colonialism. So we challenge each of you to carry these truths with you in your daily lives, in your hearts and in your actions. And we challenge each of you to be a part of the indigenization of all spaces.
So at this point, I'm going to talk you through a brief rundown of what we'll be doing today. I always say after that particular land acknowledgement that I really appreciate it in that it calls us not only to consider, but also it calls us to action. And I think it's in that spirit that we also kind of talked and developed this particular presentation. The other thing that I like about this agenda is that we're already partway through it. So we'll be talking, we're here right now. Oh, I don't know if you can see but we're currently at the introduction. We'll be talking about our sort of our central premise, talking about the importance of family, defining family, and talking also about people's rights to family. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Then we'll be talking about families in Canada and how they may interact with the immigration system and the disconnect that we've been able to identify. We'll talk about it in terms of particular examples. And then we'll give you a couple of social work practice and policy sort of suggestions and recommendations that we were able to come up with. I'm actually really looking forward to hearing folks' questions, and that's what we'll take right after What Next.
So as with all presentations and all classes, we do teach after all, we would like to be very clear about our goals. So here are our learning outcomes for this webinar. We're hoping that by the end of the presentation, the participants, that's you, will be able to describe some of the ways in which the Canadian immigration system limits rights to be with family. So it has the implications this has in terms of this enforced separation of families. We're hoping that you'll understand the intersections of the immigration system with social work, and that you'll be able to critically reflect on your individual role in supporting families to navigate the system and in challenging the system and the problems with the system as a whole.
So, as I mentioned, here's our presentation problem statement. For migrant families, immigration policies are still based on traditional and Western notions of family and do not accept legitimate family forms that are recognized by other regulatory bodies, including social work bodies domestically and by other nation states. We hold that social workers are often involved in applying and adjudicating these particular policies, and we recognize them, or would like to problematize them as not only as exclusionary standards. And finally, we hold that failing to understand the implications for our clients is particularly, it will complicates their lives, ultimately. Complicates their lives. And the fact is that ultimately when you're dealing with migrant folks, we are also talking about people who are often already quite vulnerable.
So we're going to start by telling a story. A lot of this presentation comes from my PhD research, which, as I've already said, in turn came from my work with separated families. And this is one of the stories from my PhD research that a participant shared with me. So this is Giudane's story. Giudane had immigrated to Canada as a young adult, and after several years, now successfully established in a professional occupation, had attempted to sponsor his mother and younger sister. His younger sister was still a minor. His sister had been brought up by his mother since she had been a baby and had always been considered part of the family, as is not uncommon in their country of origin. When the Canadian authorities requested a DNA test, though, and realised that mother and daughter were not biologically related, they required that his sister be removed from the application. So Giudane reluctantly did remove his sister from the application, and his mother joined him in Canada, leaving her daughter with other relatives back in the home country. However, at the time of the interview, Giudane reported that his mother had found it too difficult to be separated from her daughter, with whom she was closer than Giudane, her biological son, and that she decided to return home to her country of origin to reunite with her daughter, thus rendering the family separated across continents indefinitely. So my PhD research was on families trying to reunite in Canada and their experiences as they went through that process of trying to reunite. And what came through loud and clear from all participants was the importance of family. And we're going to get into definitions and how we're defining family shortly. And this is something that we're all obviously aware of as social workers. We understand that we are all social beings, and that the individual and families, however that's defined, constitute our most basic social components. We know as social workers that the people we're close to help to meet many of our basic needs. They provide emotional and social support. They provide a sense of belonging, security, and protection. And in relation to migration in particular, close positive relationships have been shown over and over again to help before, during, and after the migration process with the many stresses that people come up against during those process. So, for example, in reducing the negative psychological impacts of migration and improving settlement outcomes. And I just want to add here, I think this has become a lot clearer for everybody during recent months, the impacts of family separation, as many more people have experienced what it's like to be separated indefinitely from family members as a result of government policy in relation right now to COVID. So there's so many people that are separated from their family members than there ever have been. And while we're thinking about that, it's also, I'd like to just point out that it's only been going on for a few months, and it's really difficult already for those who are experiencing family separation as a result of COVID. For a lot of the immigrants we're talking about, as we'll get into later, it can be years and years and years that they're experiencing this separation as a result of government policy.
I really appreciate that, the sort of contextualization with that. Thinking about our own experiences with COVID gives us for these kinds of questions. So, of course, there are multiple definitions of family. And if you think about the people around you and how they choose to support other people, you can think of all kinds of different forms, family forms. There's a diversity of family forms, I guess, as many as there are a diversity of people. But the one thing that we would like you to consider is that in the global north, the nuclear family is still regarded as the fundamental kind of community building block. And when we say the nuclear family, we are sort of thinking about a heterosexual couple of mom and dad and their biological children. Again, we're here to problematize that definition, but have to recognize its social currency. So ultimately, what we'd also like for you to consider in thinking about this variety of families that we're talking about is that extended families in terms of distant relatives, and also functional families in terms of, you can think of like street families or I know within the queer community that oftentimes people will make families of choice. So it's important to think about, again, the fact that despite often rigid definitions, there is, we do, as social beings, tend to define who we want around us and often think of those people as family. Just so you know, and if you want to look it up, those chosen families are known as fictive kin in our research. So again, when you think about the kinds of families, when you think about the diversity of families, one of the things that Beth and I want to point out is that even as that traditional family model sort of is an undercurrent throughout the way we think of families, we do also in Canada recognize multiple family forms, right? So here we wanted to note that in Indigenous naming ceremonies and belonging to particular clans also is another sort of way of constituting family through culture, or as influenced by culture. And we also wanted to point out that things like Revenue Canada and Statistics Canada also recognize or accord certain privileges relative to one's sort of connection to folks. So I was thinking about, income splitting in terms of, I do the labor, but my partner can, I can sort of split that recognition or governmental recognition with my partner. Those of you who work in child protection will recognize that even within at least here in Ontario, and I think it is similar across Canada, that ultimately the legislation or child protection legislation often creates a certain recognition of the fact that parents may choose sort of fictive kin or customary care or repatriation of children or and the like. And again, when I mentioned earlier about choosing people and sort of this sort of give and take that goes in these relationships, I wanted just to point out that once again in our social work and our migration literature, that is known as a transactional approach.
So, as Melissa just mentioned, for families who are in Canada, different government departments recognise various different family forms. And at the international level too, there is a lot of protection for family. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is perhaps the most well-known convention that protects the family, but it's certainly not the only one. There's a number of different international human rights documents that protect family. In relation to parent-child relationships, which is what we're going to focus on primarily in the second half of this presentation, those relationships are clearly protected in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And just to quote a couple of articles from that convention, which recognises the importance of family life for children, the convention requires that all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, should take into account the best interests of the child. And it goes on to state that a child shall not be separated from his or her parents against their will. And that convention has been signed, as most of them have, by Canada. And it's also important to point out that international institutions have been very clear in encouraging the recognition of the different definitions of family, the different family forms that we see worldwide. So before we go into the deep dive on parent-child relationships, I just want to give a quick overview of the Canadian immigration system and families for those who might be less familiar with the system. And again, current circumstances, it's important to note that immigration policy is one of those areas that's constantly changing. Right now, there are a lot of different temporary policies in place. And what I'm presenting on here is the usual state of affairs. So it's not kind of taking into account the all of the extra kind of COVID restrictions that we're seeing right now. So immigration to Canada is governed by the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, IRPA, which is a massive piece of legislation dating from the early 2000s and that is constantly updated. And while the vast majority of IRPA goals are around doing what's deemed best for the Canadian economy and society, it does clearly state objectives that relate to family reunification for both immigrants and refugees. They're governed by different sections of the Act, so there are different goals to address family reunification for both of them. It also clearly states that the Act should comply with those international human rights obligations that I was talking about a couple of slides ago. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the system, Canadian immigration system, there are three main streams of permanent immigration: economic, refugee, and family class. Each of those streams has a lot of different programs within the stream, and each of those streams has provisions around family members. In the economic and refugee streams, so these are programs where an individual will qualify according to the criteria under the particular program, and assuming that individual qualifies themselves under the program criteria, they can be accompanied by their nuclear family members, so their spouse or the partner, and their dependent children. For refugees, they can either come as a family, or if it's a refugee who's claimed refugee status here, they have to go through the inland determination for Canada to decide they're a refugee after they've arrived. But once that's decided, then they can bring their family members in. Family class is that third stream of the immigration system, and this is where Canadian citizens or permanent residents have the right to apply to sponsor family members to come and join them in Canada. Again, those nuclear family members, and then as well through family class, people can under certain criteria, can apply to sponsor their parents or their grandparents. So those are the three permanent immigration streams. And then we have the temporary immigration streams. And these, again, are divided into two kind of general umbrella programs that each, again, have lots and lots of more targeted programs underneath them. But the two umbrella programs are the International Mobility Program. This includes things like NAFTA, well, USMCA workers now, exchanges between what are usually like the Western, the global North countries. International academics come under the International Mobility Program, family members of international students. This program is basically people in privileged positions who are coming to do highly paid jobs, or they're coming to study. They are allowed to be accompanied by their spouse or partner and children. So again, that nuclear family can come with them while they are temporarily in Canada. On the other hand, we have the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which is supposedly for temporary work to fill temporary gaps, although we know that more often than not, these are hardly temporary gaps. The two most commonly known programs within that umbrella program are the Caregiver Program and Seasonal Agricultural Workers. There are a number of other programs that fall under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, and it's much more related to low-paid, precarious jobs. In relation to the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, those workers who are in Canada under that stream, they cannot be accompanied by family members, with the small exception of the Caregiver Program. You may have seen in the news, after years and years of the caregiver community advocating for themselves, they were finally allowed, like it was just happened last year, the rules are finally changed so that they could bring in their family members when they came as temporary foreign workers. But none of the others, so the seasonal agricultural workers, for example, they cannot be accompanied by family members. In terms of eligibility criteria to be able to come to Canada based on a family relationship, the general eligibility criteria for all immigration applicants apply. So whatever program anybody's applying through, whether they're applying as a family member or as an economic immigrant or a refugee, they have to not be inadmissible for security or medical reasons. So if there are certain security issues, if there are certain medical issues, they can be refused. And if this is a family member that's being refused, for example, for medical reasons, then the whole family can be denied. So every once in a while, we will see in the news cases of people being denied for medical reasons. So, for example, if we've had cases where somebody's child is deaf, and then the immigration authorities have said that's going to be too expensive, like for medical reasons, that's going to be too expensive for Canada, and so they'll refuse everybody's applications. The disability advocates have done quite a lot of work around that as well. They did get the restrictions lifted somewhat in the last couple of years, but they are still there. So it's still affecting a lot of people. And then on top of those security and medical criteria that everybody has to meet, there are eligible criteria specific to the family relationship. So for those who are actually applying as on the basis of a family relationship, they need to convince the visa officers that they have a genuine relationship. So for spouse, common law and conjugal partners, they have to provide documentation to prove to the visa officer who happens to be reviewing their application that they have a genuine relationship. And there has been a lot of critique in the research. My dissertation certainly did a lot of critique about what those constructions are, about what constitutes a genuine relationship. And for parent and child relationships, if they're a biological relationship, then the visa officers might ask for DNA tests if they're not satisfied with the documentation. There's research being done about how skewed the requests for DNA tests are in terms of asking for the tests from certain part of the world, especially African countries, and how racist that is. And so that's the DNA test. That's Giordani's story that I was just referring to earlier. If it's an adoptive relationship, if it's a non-biological relationship, then the only way that they will be approved is if the adoption conforms to the Hague Convention and is approved by the provincial adoption authority. So this is a piece where the social workers are really, really embedded in the system, because immigration requests the approval of adoptions from the provincial adoption authorities. And then finally, there are eligibility criteria for certain reunification programs, most specifically where for those who are sponsoring parents and grandparents, there are quite strict criteria around minimum income. The sponsor has to have been earning LICO plus 30%, so that's quite a substantial income for the previous 3 years. And so that has all sorts of discriminatory implications as well. So this is how I try to depict access to family for migrants on a continuum. At the one end, so at the left there, we have the seasonal workers under the temporary worker program who are completely barred from being together in Canada. They're always separated when they come to Canada, and sometimes they're 6 months every year after year. At the other end, we have the privileged families who migrate to Canada together, whether that's as permanent or temporary residents, so they never experience the separation. And then in between the two extremes, we have this continuum of families who are separated but have different experiences as they try to reunite. So for some families, it might be relatively easy, but for others, it could take years. So for example, if it's somebody who claimed refugee status in Canada, that will already have taken usually years to go through that process before they then start the process of bringing their family members in. So they can be separated for years. And just to complicate this even further, for those families in those middle two doors who are trying to reunite, but they're still separated but trying to reunite, they may or may not have access to temporary visas that allow them to be together temporarily as they're waiting for the permanent residency application to be together permanently. And so this is taken from my PhD research as well. And it was specifically around partners who were waiting, going through the reunification process. They were waiting for the finalization of their applications. And as you can see in there, there's a huge difference where the partner who was being sponsored to come to Canada was from the Europe or USA. 82% of those couples figured out a way to be together, could be together because they could access temporary visas, or they didn't have visa requirements. Whereas for Central and South America, it was only 24%. So we see again those racist barriers like there and coming to bear. And then we think about the impacts. And again, this is really important for social workers to think about. So my PhD research wasn't the first time I'd studied family separation. For my MSW, I'd spoken to immigrants who arrived in Canada all by themselves, separated from their families and friends. And most of the participants described ways in which they'd been able to mitigate social isolation by forging new social relationships, for example, with colleagues, if they were working at school, through their church communities, those kind of things. But emotional isolation, loneliness and loss as a result of separation from attachment figures was a much more persistent theme that could continue for years. And another persistent theme was damage to those relationships, those really close relationships, especially when the separation had been lengthy. Some of the participants felt really guilty about having been left, so they didn't like to hear their family members, whether this was parents, whether this was children, upset on the other end of the phone. They described the stress of calling people at home and how that actually led to avoidance behavior. They stopped calling home because it was too stressful to do so, given the impacts and the kind of uncertainty of when they might be able to reunite. And they also described how alone they felt, that nobody understood them as a whole. So they either knew people in Canada who knew who they were in Canada, or they knew people in their home country who knew who they were in the home country. But because they'd gone through this experience all by themselves, they felt like nobody knew who they were as a whole. So those are the impacts of the separation, and then the impacts of the actual process of applying for reunification. And these are when I get to my PhD research. We have a few quotes there, and I saw impacts on all different aspects of well-being. So negative physical, emotional, mental, financial impacts, and also implications for the relationships of those who were separated. On the one hand, I did have people who talked about how it actually strengthened their relationship going through this really difficult experience together. But there were many, many people who talked about the negative impacts that it had on the relationship as well. So what does all of this have to do with social work? I'm sure as you're listening to me talk, you're each thinking of the connections to your particular situation. But just to point out some obvious ones, regardless of which field of social work you're in, there's obviously a good chance that you'll be working with clients for whom this is relevant. And in each of these cases, it's important to understand the full picture to be able to fully support and work with the clients. So as a social worker in Canada, you may work directly with or on issues relating to temporary workers who are explicitly prevented from being with family members, immigrants who are prevented from being with family members due to eligibility requirements, Immigrants and refugees who may or may not have recently arrived, who are separated from family and trying to reunite but maybe facing a number of barriers, families who have reunited after short or long separations, and families who have migrated together. And so we've provided a brief overview of the context of family there. We've given an introduction to the immigration system in terms of how it relates to families. And for the second half of this presentation, we're going to do this deep dive into one problem in the system, specifically the ways in which the immigration defines family, and specifically parent-child relationships. And it's in an area in which, like, as I've already mentioned, social workers are really embedded. So I'm going to start with a second story, and this was another participant in my PhD research. Sarah and her husband came to Canada as refugees, eventually gaining Canadian citizenship. They had tried unsuccessfully for many years to have a child. When they became aware that a family friend in their country of origin was looking for an adoptive family for her baby, this baby was in danger because she was the result of an extramarital affair, everybody thought they'd found a win-win situation. Sarah had been told that as Canadian citizens, it would be easy for them to bring the child to Canada, so they returned briefly to their country of origin to complete the adoption through the domestic courts with the full support of the birth mother. This advice that Sarah had been given was wrong. At the time of the interview with me, Sarah and her husband had been trying for 8 years to bring this child to Canada, and while the child remained living with her elderly grandmother in the country of origin. The situation had understandably worn extremely heavily on Sarah and her husband, who had increasing fears as the child approached teenage years in an unstable environment. And the child was confused and upset about why she could not simply join her parents in Canada.
Thanks, Beth. So at this point, we'd like for you to take all of the thoughts that you've been having and think about them relative to the problem statement that we opened with. Remember, for migrant families, immigration policies are still based on traditional and Western notions of family and do not accept legitimate family forms that are recognized in other regulatory bodies. That we as social workers are often involved in applying and adjudicating these particular policies and perpetrating the exclusion and the problematics that, the problematics that are associated with it. And that finally failing to understand the implications for our clients of immigration policy can further complicate the lives of those that are already vulnerable. Right? So we're gonna offer you sort of 4 propositions based on what we've talked about. The first one being that the limited definition of family that there's a limited definition of family in Canadian immigration policy, and so what we contend and what we hope that we've been able to exemplify is that the Canadian immigration policy makes assumptions about what constitutes family, but that those assumptions are inconsistent with family forms as we understand them and experience them within Canada. They're inconsistent with family forms as people understand them and experience them outside of Canada, and they're not in keeping with the sort of the international rights and conventions that Canada is a signatory to. I remember Beth and I having a conversation about the idea of migrants and their families having to pass through a sieve, the sieve of the immigration process. The second, our second proposition is that ultimately, when one becomes an immigrant to Canada, because of these policies, there is what we're calling a marginalization of transnational life. So you'll remember that Sarah was returning to her home country, right, a country where she was a citizen, to finalize what ultimately was a local adoption between citizens of the country, but that ultimately what their family is sort of getting caught by or hooked on is this idea that it was not in fact a domestic adoption, but an international one. And so you'll see here that this particular key informant said the most common type of file I deal with that involves problems in the second stage is where a parent tries to sponsor an adopted family member, where the adoption was done as a private domestic adoption. Many countries, such as China, will allow citizens of their country who are not habitually resident in their country to adopt family members through a domestic adoption without following the Hague Convention. Then, when the parent tries to sponsor the child, CIC says the adoption is not valid because it didn't follow the Hague Convention. So ultimately, when you think about this sort of marginalization of transnational life, the sort of inability of Canadian immigration to see that a person might have rights that are different from the rights that are associated with their Canadian selves, it's ultimately the research around this area reminds us that we can't be thinking of countries as sort of being separate entities, as being separate entities and being sort of independent and isolated. When you think about these sort of ideas in the context of migration, we're actually saying that we're rejecting these sort of previous ideas of, you were one nationality here and now you're here and you're this different nationality, but we're trying to have research recognize, and I guess the field ultimately does, or has begun to recognize that people live transnational lives, right? And that the rights accorded to them as transnational people, as migrant people, may require special understanding. Who belongs and who doesn't, right? So the gap that we've identified really talks about different levels of scrutiny and different results for the right to life. So I remember one of the things that we talked about would be that I could get married in the next hour and decide that I'm going to, go down and sponsor my partner. But ultimately, in doing that, I'm given an opportunity to prove the depth and the validity of the relationship. When you think of a family like Judana's, there's no opportunity to do that, right? There's no opportunity to do it at all. Here are her school records. Here she is at the birthday party, for instance, right? So one of the things that we wanted to be able to problematize is this idea of the politics of belonging, that actually nation states regulate membership, yes, who is in and who is out, but that one of the groups of people who get excluded in that analysis are migrants, and in thinking about their rights to family, ultimately the right to family reunification has no guarantees. So given the way inclusion is regulated, the right to a parent-child relationship is closely related to race, to class, to nationality. And again, I sort of resist the urge early on to talk about this because I knew this slide was coming up. But I'm sure even as we were talking throughout the presentation, you can think about, well, that's going to be really difficult if you don't have money, or that's going to be really difficult, you can think about the complicating vectors that are associated with this sort of insider-outsider who gets to come in and how. And so one of the things that we wanted to point out is, again, that as the regulation stands, they facilitate what from, I guess, the sort of Canadian regulatory system's view is a typical adoption, right? And sort of the typical adoption is where Canadian parents decide that they will go and adopt internationally, right? And the thing that we sort of are trying to problematize is this sort of idea that privileged parents can sort of operate as consumers. If a particular nation state closes down, well then, you can just go to the next one over, or one around the corner, or et cetera, right? Whereas when one considers migrants who may wish to adopt and may wish to exercise their rights within their home countries, this kind of, they cannot exercise this particular privilege. and for us to recognize that the regulations are sort of written in order to facilitate this kind of attitude of privileged parents as consumers. So what are we calling for? We're hoping that in talking about this, first and foremost, we can begin to call for a respect for international regulations. Of course, we're in favor of that. But one of the things that we've learned in talking about this is that we're calling for a respect for local regulations. So the idea of a domestic adoption occurring in another country should be enough, right, for the Canadian immigration system, that there's a respect for transnational histories of parents. Again, that it's not the person before they came to Canada and now as Canadian, but literally recognizing that as this person moves through the immigration system, I never thought I would be using my hands as a prop for this, but as the person moves through the immigration system, that they are the same person, the transnational migrant. And so we're calling for folks to recognize that those people, transnational migrants, do have rights that are in addition or superimposed or melded, however you want to describe it, with these Canadian rights, and that we should be able to sort of consider that because this person is Canadian and also another national. And so we're asking, us to consider the recognition of more obscured family experiences. Because again, we can talk a lot about transnational adoption, but we don't really talk about transnational adoption as experienced by migrants, right? Or nationals of those countries. Finally, we want to be able to advocate for a consideration of the best interests of the child. Thinking once again about every child's right to be able to be in a safe, caring, loving home and with their parents. And we also want to sort of think about or to problematize this idea of the best interests of the child only applying to child protection. But it doesn't, in that the best interest of the child is one of these sort of notions that really should be sort of going, sort of with its tendrils going out into all areas of social work practice, and that ultimately, as a social worker in practice, you may find yourself working with an adult where the best interest of the child is something that is really important. The implications of that are really important for the adult and the associated child.
So just to summarize, what happens in terms of these non-biological parent-child relationships in the context of migration, hopefully it's become clear that the right to family life depends on a number of different factors. It depends on whether the parents and children are from different different countries, so for example, Canada and another country, or whether they're from the same country, so the parent's country of origin is the same country as where the child is from. It depends on whether the relationship existed prior to migration or not. It depends on whether the child was adopted officially and whether the adoption followed the Hague Convention. So we see here that usually for non-biological relationships are only recognized if there was an adoption that followed the Hague Convention, and that misses out all of these other types of family relationships, including Giordani's family and Sarah's family. So we've identified how the Canadian immigration regulations are concerned only with certain contexts, specifically parents from Canada adopting children from the great global south, and cases like those of Sarah and Giordani aren't considered. And as a result, the immigration system and adoption conventions work together to keep those families separated indefinitely. So in terms of conclusions, we've discussed how immigration policy functions to exclude certain parent-child relationships that are seen to be non-traditional. And as a result, certain migrants, usually from the global south, don't have the right to family life. And unless they have the resources to pay for a lawyer to find a solution, there is a tiny little kind of humanitarian stream that can be used to get around these issues, but it's very expensive to get lawyers to navigate that that. So we see the intersections with class as well there. And unless they have those resources, they can be separated for years or indefinitely. So we're arguing that policies should recognise that migrants have those transnational lives. The policies should treat migrants who are adopting from their home countries differently, recognising that due to recognising that the current humanitarian exemption
With regards to the our recommendations with regards to social work, one of the things that I had written down here is recognize that people will fall through the cracks. But I think more importantly, what we're trying to say is recognize that people have already fallen through the cracks. That many of the regulations that we are being tasked with applying actually do have implicit bias that is built in. That we are called to advocate for individuals, but even as as we may often be advocating for individuals, we are really advocating on behalf of groups, in terms of family. And to also encourage you to bring a deeper understanding of the best interests of the child is something that that should be working its way into sort of all forms of practice. I think ultimately, in the end, what we're hoping that we can begin to do is look at immigration and migration as a holistic experience, one that values and respects the humanity of the migrant, both pre, during, and post the immigration experience, to also recognize the toll that these kinds of separations take on individuals. And I really, again, really appreciated Beth sort of contextualizing with regards to COVID-19, and to ultimately to encourage you to manage pre-migration expectations, to think about programs that might reduce isolation between more recent migrants, and an awareness of these policies, a better awareness of the policies, because again, as we noticed with one of the examples, bad advice can be quite costly. Ultimately to, as our ethical responsibility calls upon us to do, to recognize our role in advocacy around these issues. So on behalf of Beth and myself, thank you so much. And we look forward to your questions.
Amazing. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was muted and then unmuted and then off video. So thank you so much. What an incredible presentation. I am so excited to dive into the Q&A. So for anyone who has tuned in maybe a little bit late and missed my introduction, we have two functions here. There's the chat function and the Q&A function. If you want your messages to be private, feel free to use the Q&A tab. If you want it to be public, where other people can discuss your question as well, you can use the chat function. So feel free to type some of your questions in right now. We have about 10 minutes with our presenters, so get those questions in. One of my first questions was when you talked about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and you talked about this document in terms of international human rights law. Can you speak to some of the accountability that comes from treaty or covenants such as these in terms of Canada implementing policies that align with international human rights law?
I can start if you want, and it's a slightly different, it's a different area, but it's something I talk about when I'm teaching. So that's the problem. That's the problem with the international human rights obligations. They don't have something that really kind of is really hard hitting, that and definitive in to be able to get Canada to comply. But what they do have are the UN people who come and study the country and see whether they are meeting their obligations. And so something I talk about a lot in my classes is how Canada has been has been cited time and time again in terms of not meeting its obligations under the Convention for the Rights of the Child in relation to Indigenous children. So they've studied, and they call out Canada on that over and over again. So that's kind of like, this is the problem. There aren't any kind of like good teeth. I don't know if Melissa wants to add anything to that.
No, exactly. I actually was banging on my teeth while you were talking, but I think that, to pick up on the point that that Beth was making, ultimately, if there's one thing I know about Canadians, we are totally happy to talk about how much better we are than a lot of folk. And I think that actually that is one of the ways in which human rights legislation can actually, sort of covenants and the fact that we are signatory to these things, that is one of the ways in which human rights advocacy can take place in this country, right? So the idea of people coming year after year after year to say, to make these same damning conclusions with regards to the treatment of Indigenous people or, Indigenous children in particular was the example that Beth used. That is the opportunity for us to be, as Canadians, right, or as people living within this territory, to pick that up and say, listen, we don't want to be embarrassed by the behavior of our society anymore. We think that we can make these changes. As a matter of fact, we demand these changes, right? So while it is true that they don't have teeth in the way that one would think of, like criminal sanctions, for instance, there are real opportunities with regards to face, sort of saving face.
I just want to add, can I just add one more thing to that as well? Like with immigration, it's always really important to remember that before they have citizenship, immigrants don't get a vote. And so who the government is paying attention to and who they're accountable to. And so when we're thinking about immigration policy, you always need to take into consideration, think about the fact that immigrants don't have a vote. So how much is the government gonna listen? But that's where we see with sponsorship, because some of the people doing the sponsoring do have a vote, and so they have slightly more power than with other immigrant populations. So for example, the temporary foreign workers,
right,
who have no kind of power in terms of the government at all.
Yeah,
agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I like to flag when we talk about human rights, because social work is such a field based in human rights, and so it's good to have an opportunity to discuss a little bit about how it looks like when we sign on to these covenants and treaties and international accords, and how as social workers we can implement human rights policies that are in line with certain covenants, such as the rights of the child. So thank you. I think that was great. Another question that actually came in was in terms of there's been calls recently. Someone flagged that there's been calls for a commissioner for children to be established. So a commissioner for children and youth. Can you speak to maybe how this role potentially could help in terms of family reunification and the best interest of the child? Do you agree that there should be a commissioner for children and youth? What are your thoughts?
Did you want to go first again, Beth?
Sure. Yeah, I can. So that's really interesting, because I know Ontario had the children's commissioner who was kind of the power was really taken away by Doug Ford, right? And so there were so if they were going to be anything because I don't that's not my area of expertise, but I know that people who were actually affected by things were upset when that position got taken away. So it seems yes, it would be a useful thing to have. What I'd be really interested about in this context is what their mandate is and how that relates to non-Canadian children again. Mm-hmm. So whether they would just be the commissioner for children who are within Canada, or whether they would also be considering non-Canadian children. Melissa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important to consider, and Beth kind of raised it towards the end, is that not everybody within this territory is treated the same way. I think that people do sort of often walk around with that assumption, you know what I mean? And I would agree that it would be important to think about the mandate. And ultimately, I think that a real commitment, sort of imagining my own sort of perfect office, right? I think a real commitment would actually change a lot in terms of what we were doing. A real commitment to respecting the rights of children would change social work practice in a big way, and would also change policy implementation in a really big way as well.
Yeah. Another question that came up from somebody who is very new to all of this, but has found themselves working with a lot of immigrants, newcomers to Canada. Can you give a couple big tips and tricks for some of the best practices in terms of ensuring that social workers are able to, work with these clients in a respectful manner?
Listen to people, right? And I know that it is sort of a sort of on the nose way of talking, but like, I think that, or to start, but I do think this sort of idea of listening to people. The other thing that I would also point out is, a lot of Canadian rhetoric is actually dehumanizing of immigrants and particular types of immigrants as well. Thinking and so that to recognize that in all of your dealings, I think again, if you're going to be working with immigrants, you better really understand the regulations that apply to them. Do you know what I mean? Because again, and I mentioned this earlier, but as we've seen, mistakes can have really devastating consequences, right? It can have human rights denying consequences. I'll pass it to Beth.
Yeah, so I was going to say that understanding the system piece. And then the other thing, to go back to something that we mentioned, is thinking holistically about each client or family or whoever you're working with, and recognizing that their situation is going to be unique. And that there's going to be these pieces. So especially, something that I go on about all the time, like recognizing, if you're thinking about an immigrant family, it's not just the people who are physically present in Canada. There are also, when you're doing those genograms, like there's also people outside of Canada. And also not falling into this trap that a lot of people fall into, to think that, and that I have to stop myself from falling into, is that just because you immigrated, or your parents immigrated, or your grandparents immigrated, that every immigrant you meet has the same immigration experience that you did, or your parents or your grandparents, which is a trap that we often fall into, which is why I also always emphasize that the system is constantly changing, and we have to kind of constantly update our knowledge.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Beth, with regards to this sort of idea that everybody's having a different migration journey, and to also recognize the intersectionality of that particular journey, right? To also, sort of recognize the difference that it means to come from France versus Botswana, or where my family is from, Guyana, for instance. Oh, and growing up, I was always very much aware that my family was the small group of people in front of me, but also a whole bunch of people that were always somewhere else.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. So we've got time for one last question. It's a question that I have been asking almost all of my webinar presenters right now. It feels like we are in a position where we will hopefully chart a new way forward, rather than going back to outdated and policies that don't include everyone. So as we look to this idea of a just recovery, what would be some of your key pieces you would like to see in this idea of a just recovery? What are some of the biggest areas Canada can focus on in terms of changing policy to better support newcomers and family reunification?
So I'm going to, if you don't mind me going first, Melissa, I'm going to connect it back to what I said close to the beginning, where I found it really fascinating, because there's a few of us, not many people study families and immigration. Most of the immigration research is refugees or economic immigration. But there's a few of us who've been trying to push this for quite a while now and not getting much traction. And then all of a sudden with COVID, and you see, so many more people who are separated. Just this morning, I had an email from people who are separated saying, "Hey, we found your research. Like, can we talk?" So there's more and more people, and people who have a bigger voice. And so my hope is that now that more people are realizing what it's like the implications of being separated and the impacts of being separated, is that's gonna hopefully kind of wend its way hopefully into the policies. And I do have to say there have been some improvements since the experiences of the people in my research. I should acknowledge that the current government did make some changes to make it better, but there's still a long way to go. And so that would be my hope, now that a lot more people have experienced what it's like, that the family separation piece might be addressed a bit more. Melissa?
Yeah, so I think that, recognizing time, my comment will be a little bit more general, and I would just say that that ultimately what I'm hoping that people will recognize is that there were all kinds of debates, sort of social policy and social debates, where we were being told that things had to be the way they were because there was no choice. And that all of a sudden, right, things like, all of a sudden we had something that kind of looks a lot like basic income, for instance, right? So I think that it's also really important in general for us as social workers and as social advocates to consider that all of the things that we need to be true are indeed true, right? It wasn't about the fact that we don't have choices, or we didn't have a choice. It was about the choices that were being made. Right. And that with COVID, nobody's going to lie. COVID has blown open our lives. Right. And some of the stuff that's skittering around is ugly, but I think at the same time, we have a wonderful opportunity, right? You wouldn't be in this profession if you didn't believe in the power of transformation. We have a wonderful opportunity to literally say, this is not what we're about. Right? We're not going back to that because it's not who we are. You know what I mean? And that, that when I'm doing my worst makes me, when I'm feeling my worst, keeps me hopeful. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, we feel that way as well. So I'll give a little plug out for anyone who is in practice and is in frontline work. Please consider some advocacy. Please consider some opportunities to engage and push for political will. It's what we do at the CSW. It's why we're here. We represent you, but you can push us too. You can push us to push the government as well. And please take some time to speak with your MPs, speak with elected officials, speak within your organizations about what this new future could hopefully look like in terms of a just recovery that includes a lot better policy than a lot of the things that we have been seeing in terms of human rights, in terms of family reunification, in terms of the best interests of the child. So with that, I think I'm going to conclude. Any final thoughts?
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you. I'm just like, with the internet, you could have spent your time anywhere. I'd like to thank you for being here with us.
Exactly. That's what I always say in the beginning. I'm like, you spent an hour with us again. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
So thank you to everyone. Thank you to our incredible webinar presenters. Please feel free to get in touch with the CSW any way you like: Facebook, Twitter, email. I always love to hear from you and hear your comments and your questions, and hopefully your pushes for different policy and political change. We want to hear what you are doing in the field and learn more about the work that you're doing, especially in this time. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you soon.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thanks, Ben.